I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm gonna start going over chapter 4, but I'll only do it for the first hour, so I'll give you another hour that you can hopefully, if you're behind. Now, just so you know, for next week we'll end up in the C class. We'll end up being lab for both periods. All right. Then we're still going over the book in the Joomla class, so that'll be lecture. This class next week will also be a lab. All right, and what do we have? And Java will also be a lab next week, and the PHP we'll see how far we get this week. All right, but we've gone over chapters 1, 2, 3, and 5 from our book, but we didn't go over chapter 4 yet. So I plan on doing that now. Again, we're going to go over as much as we can handle in about an hour. Then you'll have lab, and we'll finish it up on Thursday. When you come in on Thursday, I'll have your first assignment for this class. Like I said, the first assignment for the C class is out there already. All right, and it was emailed to you, so you've got all that material. We're going to go over a bunch of programs tomorrow in the C class, and then all next week will be lab. So you're going to have a lot of lab next week. All right. So again, I'm on page 117, chapter 4, how to develop a multiple page website. And as you can see with what's in here, we'll talk about 2 pages from that shopping cart app that they'll be dealing with, and they'll go through the files and folders that are needed for the app. We'll talk about that somewhat. All right, get into how to work with multiple web page sites. All right, and we'll start to get into today how to create and use data sources. We'll see where we are when we get to that point. All right, and we'll talk about session state, and then towards the end of the chapter they actually get into code. So we will be talking about code in this chapter. All right. So the 2 pages of the shopping cart app are shown here on page 119, and they are the order page that you see here, and underneath it you see the associated cart page. Now again, with the order page that you see here where it says please select a product, there's a drop-down list, and that drop-down list is literally going to be hooked up to a database, and when it gives you, when you choose an option from the database, all right, what it'll end up doing is populating the rest of this stuff here. So in other words, it'll give you the title, it'll give you the short description, it'll give you the long description, and it'll give you the price. Does all that make sense? So you won't have to put that in, nor should you have to. Plus, by putting it in the database, anytime there are changes, if something goes on sale, goes off sale, whatever, all right, you only have to change the database, and as soon as they go and rerun the program again, it'll be automatically brought up to date. All right. So you notice that if you go through this and you click the Add to Cart button, and then you click Go to Cart, that this is what's going to come up here. Again, it's got the same theme or motif in it, whether it's the order page or the cart page. Right now, this is just basically just like the equivalent of like a text area, or I guess it's probably a list box, that has in there everything that you are that you have ordered thus far. Then if you highlight an item and click remove it, it'll be removed. If you want to totally clear your cart out at once, you can click empty cart. Some of the stuff that we're going to be doing, just so you know, I mean, some of it should just make sense. For instance, if there's nothing in your shopping cart and you click either empty cart or remove item, you should at least get a message that comes up that tells the user there's nothing in the cart, so there's nothing to remove. If you attempt to click remove item and you don't have any item highlighted, you'll put a message up that says something like you have to highlight an item before you can remove it. Again, that's all stuff that should just make sense. All right. With what they go through in here, if you click continue shopping, it'll grab you right back to the order page. And if you click checkout, as of right now, that hasn't been implemented. It will be, but it hasn't been implemented yet. In fact, I think it comes up with like a message box or something like that. I don't know what it is, but it just comes up and it says that page has not been implemented yet. All right, so that's where we'll be when we get down to the end of this. All right, so what they have you do in here, if you turn up here to page 121, and I'm going to do it, is they have you come in and create a brand new project. So I'm going to do the same. So I'm going to go back over to the virtual desktop. We don't need that up anymore. And from here, I'm going to start up Visual Studio. And this is going to be chapter 4, but it's not shopping cart as we've been doing before. Or I'm sorry, it isn't future value as we've been doing before. It's shopping cart. So I'm going to do file, whatever. Not sure why I'm getting that, but I am. All right. So file, new, website. And when it comes up, I'm just going to call it CH04 shopping cart. But this time I am going to choose the ASP.NET web form site. And hopefully at least it's creating the project for me right now. And I'll come back to it. But these are the files that we're going to eventually have in it. Now remember, since I created it, it's going to have a bunch of stuff in there that I don't need and a bunch of stuff I do need. If you remember, there's a home page and an about page and a bunch of other stuff that we get. I don't need any of that. All right, so I'm going to remove it in just a couple seconds. But it also will have the scripts that we might need, and it'll have some other stuff that we're going to eventually need. Now, we talked a little bit about this last time, but I want to mention it to you again, and that is, again, in the app code folder that we're going to add, that's where we'll put our actual classes. Remember that a class in C# is a code file that has no GUI associated with it. You all hear that? It's a C# file with no GUI associated with it. So we'll have a cart item class, a cart item list class, and a product class. We'll create all those, and they'll go into our app code folder. All right. In our app data folder, we're going to go and bring in this existing Halloween.mdf database. All right. In the images, we're going to have a bunch of images in there containing our products and the banner. Notice we're going to have 3 different CSS files. One for our shopping cart page, one for our main page, and one for our order page. And then, at least at first, we're going to have the cart.aspx and the order.aspx. And if we click the little arrows there, we'd have cart.aspx.cs and order.aspx.cs and our web config file. So there shouldn't be anything that's really new in there to you. All right, so we're looking at all this stuff that's in here. Notice it did create the app code folder for me, and it's got a bunch of stuff in it I don't need. And there's an empty app data, there's a bin file with a bunch of stuff in it that I'm not going to need, etc. But there's a bunch of stuff in here which I'm eventually going to clean up. At the end of the period, I'll clean that up, and I'll throw it out there, all right, for what we've done so far. Now, my hope is when they go through this and they talk about these special folders and these files, etc., there's nothing that's in there that's on the bottom of page 121 that's over anybody's head. That should all make sense to you now. Again, what those folders are, what the files in there are, etc., because that's what we're going to be building as we go on in here. All right? All right. So they talk about how to work with multi-page websites starting here on page 122. And they mention here, it says, all of the sites in this book are started from the empty website template. However, there is the website template that you should be aware of, which is the one I used. So I didn't use the one that the author uses in here. So I'm going to have to go and clean a bunch of garbage out of here. And it's kind of a crapshoot over which one is better. You already know from the last chapter that if you start with the empty project, that you're going to have to, if you want to go and add jQuery, so if you need that scripts folder, you're going to have to go in there and use NuGet like we did before. All right? But doing it the way I'm doing it, there's a bunch of stuff, as I mentioned here, that I don't need. I really don't need any of this stuff. That stuff. I don't need any of it, so I can just delete it. All right? Now that can wreak havoc with a bunch of the stuff that's in here. All right? So and same kind of thing in here. I don't need any of this stuff. These are all my DLL, my dynamic link library files. I don't need any of that, so I can remove that too. All right. So as I start working my way through here, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that's in here that I don't need. All right? Okay. All right. And again, they mention what I just said to you as far as what the different files are, what the different folders are, how to use NuGet, etc., what this program will look like currently. And if this ends up being too big of a pain for me to create it that way, then I'll just remove it, and I'll go back and I'll start with an empty site. I don't really care. But I just wanted to show you, you literally can go from either one if you want to. All right. I think we've talked about some of this stuff before, but just, again, just for completeness sake, that's interesting. There we go. If I come through here, right now, if I run this, by default, I believe it's the About page that's going to come up on here first. All right, I think that's the one that's going to run right away. If for some reason I don't want that About page to run first, let's say that I want or maybe it's the default, I don't know. Let's say I want the About page to come up first. I can right mouse click on the page and choose Set as Start Page. That makes sense? That's the easiest way to do it. Usually, if I bring this one up and I try to run it from here, sometimes it will start it from there, but sometimes it'll go back to the default page. So what I'm telling you is if you want to change the default start page, you right mouse click on the page you want and just choose Set as Start Page. That's it. And again, they show you that and they mention that to you on page 124. All right. Also on 124, and I don't think this is anything new, all right, they talk about how to rename files. So for instance, if I didn't want this one to be called Contact, I can right mouse click on it and I can choose Rename. All right, notice what gets highlighted by default there. You should never change that extension. Don't change it, say, oh, I made a mistake, and then change it back, because weird things can happen when you do that. Remember that when you're working with this stuff, there's a bunch of files that are going on behind the scenes, too, that are getting constantly updated. If you start tweaking and, I was going to say twerking, but tweaking with, if you start tweaking with the names on there, it can wreak havoc with the stuff that's in here. All right, but for instance, if I didn't want this contact, I could do this. The other thing you can always do too is I can click on it, then click on it again, and the same thing will happen. All right, either one of those will work. And remember that if I change the name of default.aspx, automatically whatever I change the default part, the default.aspx.cs will also change automatically. I don't even think it'll let you do a rename on this one. See, it doesn't. All right, it's just the ASPX that you can rename. But they talk about renaming and a few other things on here on 125, and they show you some examples. Again, it's not that it's a big thing, but I just wanted to mention it to you so at least you've seen it. All right, so again, I don't want the About page. I don't want that default page. I don't know what bundle config is. I don't even want the default ASPX right now. I don't want the fav icon. I probably shouldn't remove the global ASPX. But I at least don't want those. So I'm going to right mouse click and just choose delete. You may or may not be able to hear that, but I do get the the bell rings and it says, hey, these are going to be permanently deleted. Yeah, I don't want them. All right. And probably I'm removing enough stuff in here that I'm probably going to, this is going to be totally hosed when I try to run it later, but that's okay. Like I said, then I'll just do it the other way. I'm not really that concerned. So now I don't have any of that stuff in here. Under account, yeah, it's got stuff set up so I can do logins. I don't want that folder, so I can remove that. All right, I want app code, I want app data. Bin will be created for me automatically. I don't need Bootstrap, so I can get rid of that. I'm not going to play with fonts, so I can get rid of that. I don't need scripts, so I can I'll keep scripts. Maybe I'll want that. That's mainly the reason I brought that in here. But as I come through here and start adding information, for instance, under app code, right now, if I want to come in and I want to add, I'll do a new item, and notice that right near the top is class. Well, there are 3 classes that I'm going to want to eventually add in here, and they are, again, cartitem.cs, cartitemlist.cs, and product.cs. So if I come through here and I type in product.cs, all right, you'll notice that it builds it for me and it puts it in here. If I come in and add another one, and I say cart item, all and I come in and do one more, and I add, and this is cart item list, I believe it was. Oops. Again, there's a reason that I'm doing this, and it's not to waste my time, and it's not to waste your time. But you notice they've all been put in here. Again, the time, if you decide that you made a mistake naming this stuff, the time, so let's say that on any of these, now I've opened them all, but let's pretend I hadn't opened any of them yet. If I decided that I made a mistake naming them, the time to change them is before you even open it. Because again, there's a bunch of intermediate files in here. What will happen is if I rename this one right here, and I've already opened it up in here, it doesn't rename it in here. You understand what I'm saying? So the name will be changed in the file, but the name on the actual program won't be changed. All right? And again, it may not sound like a big thing, and it's not until you go and try to run the program and use those files. All right? Then sometimes there's no way to link them back up. I've had that happen where I literally have to remove it and recreate it again. So how to change the start page, we already went over that. On 124, we went over the renaming. On 126, I just went over how you would come in and add a class. All right, so we've seen all that stuff. And again, that's all stuff you've done stuff similar to that before in other classes. What's new, what is new, starts here on 128. This may be between 128 and about 131. If not the most important thing in the chapter, it's among the most important things in the chapter. So what they show you in text on 128 and in code on 129 are three ways that you can do a redirect or a transfer to another page. So we're going to look at all three of those ways, and then when we get done, we're going to look at yet another way you can do it on 130 and 131. So they mention here, as it says, when you develop a page or an app rather, where you're going to have more than one page, you need ways to go back and forth between pages. All right? And as they say, there's three ways of doing this are what are presented on the page. Now, I just want to quickly go over the difference between these. You'll notice the first one here, when you use the transfer method, ASP.NET immediately terminates execution of the current page. So it's like you close the current page and you're automatically opening up another page. All right? So it says the drawback of using this method is when the new page is sent to the browser has no way of returning to a different page. Technically, usually, like even clicking your back button won't work. All right? So as it says, the URL for the original page, the system doesn't know yet that you've changed, so it may still have the URL for the old page up there, even though you've gone to another page. Because you literally, it's like a go-to, for lack of better words. All right? So as it says, the URL for the original page might oftentimes be displayed in the browser's address box, which can be confusing, because if they bookmark the page, it's going to bookmark the old page. All right, so I misspoke a little before. Quite often, you'll use the redirect. That's the second one. Notice what it says. When this method is executed, it sends the special redirect message back to the browser, which causes the new request to be sent to the server to request a new page. All right, so it goes through the process that it would normally go through. And as they mentioned, it's going to take a little longer, especially if the page that you are going to load is a little bit complex, has a lot of images in it, or whatever. But as it says, the user friendliness of doing it this way normally outweighs the performance gain. Now, you'll know when you start doing this which one to use, because if you do use the redirect method and it seems to be taking way, way too long, then you wouldn't use it. All right. So notice they said also in there, it says, unlike the transfer and redirect, the redirect permanent method is used when the page is physically moved or renamed within a website. So as it says, the only time you should do that typically is if you're fixing a broken link or you're about to rename a page. All right. So they show you this in code here about the middle of page 129. And it's not that it's hard. You'll notice server.transfer, response.redirect, and response.redirect permanent. All right, again, these are the two you're going to use most often. And if you're trying to have a user-friendly site, most often you're going to use the response.redirect. Again, probably the only time you will not do so is when it's taking too long to go through it that way. If none of those ways seem to be sufficient, as mentioned here on page 130 in the text, it says there a fourth way to transfer is to use a cross-page posting. And as it says, you specify the URL of another page in the postback URL property of a button control. All right, so literally it's like when you click the button, you're telling it to go there. There's yet another way that they're not even really talking about in here, and that is, if you remember, if we go here and I jump back, let's see, I'll go, of course I don't have one now, so I'll have to come in and add a page. I'm just going to add a web form here, the default.aspx, and the code in a separate file, etc. All right. But you remember, if we go into design mode here, I'm going to bring back my toolbox, that if you don't like any of those, all right, why isn't it showing me anything? Because I still have the manage styles up. All right. View. There we go. All right, and I don't want, there we go. All right, but another way that they don't talk about in here is, notice there is someplace in here, boy, I'm really with it today, but there is a way that you can literally hyperlink. So you can send it that way too. That's not done very often. All right. Sometimes when you use the hyperlink, there can be a transfer problem in the system, knowing exactly and playing around with a back button, etc. Almost always when you do this, you're going to use one of the ways they showed before, or you're going to use, as it says, the cross-page posting that they'll talk about in here. When you use the cross-page posting, and you may have seen this before already, remember when I showed you in the project for Chapter 3 and we had the images folder, and I clicked in it, and it showed the Muroc image? Everybody know what I'm talking about? All right, you may or may not have noticed, and I probably should have mentioned it that at that time, that when we chose it, there was the tilde that's in here. And the tilde typically means you want to start back. It's the equivalent almost of saying I want to start back from the root. All right. So you'll see that again, but all they're saying is the URL in there starts with a tilde. It should automatically, to let it know from the beginning where it should start. Notice the operator is added automatically when you set the postback URL. And as they mentioned, we're going to talk more about it a little bit in just a little bit. Now, they also mention in here, it says the ASPX code for a button that posts to a different page. All right, so this is where you'll see it right there. Okay. All right. Am I right in assuming that everybody in this room knows the difference between an absolute and a relative URL? You know, absolute URL starting with HTTP, HTTPS, etc. Relative URL, so you can move your way around, all right, within the site that you're in usually. All right, so I'm not going to go through those. All they say is you can use the response.redirect, etc. to either an absolute or a relative URL. All right. All right. That jumps us up to page 134, where we talk about how to create and use data sources. Now, we're going to see, as I move back to this page, how much I've hosed it up, for lack of better words. All right. So I'm going to come in here, and one thing is, before I go in here and I start working with data sources, it's always a good idea to have a database to work with. All right, because we're about to hook a data source up to a database, and I currently don't have a database. So I'm going to right mouse click where it says app data. I'm going to choose add. I'm going to choose existing item. And I'm going to just jump all the way back here because I'm not sure where it is, but I know it's someplace on the P drive. So I'm literally going to go find my way back to the P drive here. 152, 161, ASP, fall 2014, source code, student download, database, Halloween. There it is. All right. So now I've added it. Now, are there other ways of doing it? Of course there are. But I would recommend always having a database in your system before you go in and start working with these data source controls. I will tell you that in the past, some of the stuff that we've done in here with the data source controls has been problematic. What does that mean? It means it hasn't worked well. I've never had a problem getting the data source controls to work with Access. I've had some problems getting them to work with SQL Server. So we're going to try it right now just to see what happens. All right. So jumping back to the book for just a second, as it says, to connect with a database and work with its data, you need to use the ASP.NET control called a data source. Why is that important? Because it's not here. It's under data. No, it's not. I thought it was under data. Yes, it is. There it is. Now, just so you know, some of the stuff that's in here we're going to talk about in later chapters. Some of the stuff that's in here we're almost not going to talk about at all. And let me tell you what I mean. The chart, we're not going to talk about. Literally, it allows you to embed charts inside of programs, etc. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to go into we'll talk about the data list. We'll talk a little bit about the data pager and the details view. Some of the stuff that's in here. We won't do much with most of the stuff that's in here, but we'll look at grid view almost right away. What grid view is, just so you know, once you set up your database, all right, and you set up the table you want, if you put it in a grid view, it almost looks like a spreadsheet with all of your data on it. It'll have headings and stuff in it, but it'll have all the data listed in there. All right. But after we go there, we'll go into details view where you're able to see a record at a time. So we'll go into a bunch of that stuff. We'll talk a little bit about repeater. All right. But some of the stuff, the linked data source, we probably won't even get into. All right. But what I care about right now is the SQL data source. So I'm going to literally click on there. All right. And notice it puts one on my screen. Now, this is one of those controls, just so you know, it takes up room right there, but it's an invisible control when the program runs. You do not see it. So what I want to do is I want to come in here, and I'm just going to quickly, I'm doing this off the top of my head, and it'll probably show, but I'm going to go to grid view, and I'm going to drop that in too. All right. Now what I'm going to want to do is set up a data source and then hook the grid view up to it. Does that make sense? So notice that when I click on this, it brings up a smart tag. And when I click there, it comes up to configure data source. And it says, which one do you want to connect? After I've created one, all right, or if I have that in there right away like this, it'll show that to me. Okay, so boom. So I can just choose Halloween MDF and go next. All right. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is I want to explain everything that's happening as we go through the steps here. All right, it says, do you want to save the connection in the application configuration file? So in the web.config file, if you want all that information to be saved for you, you check it. Long story short, always check that. All right, it should just always be checked. If you wanted to rename it here, but connection string is its default name, you could rename it. So I'm going to click next again. Or try to click next again and see if something happens. Yeah. I added an SQL data source. Oh, it's a grid view, I believe it is. Now it's thinking about it. And while it's thinking about it, then I'll jump back here. So what I started to show you, as it says, there is how to create an SQL data source. And as mentioned on page 134, there are a bunch of them. All right. Again, I already said this to you. It's an invisible control, so it doesn't matter where you display it on the page. Sometimes people like to put all of their data sources because you could have multiple ones on the same page. Sometimes they like to put them all down at the bottom or all at the top of the page so every data source is together. All right. It's not mandatory that you do that, but it can make it a little easier for you to work with. Again, after you add it, a smart tag is then available. If you click it and you choose configure data source, it should bring up the wizard, which is starting to do right now. All right. So notice as I come in here, it says, what do you want? Now, take a look at the screen here, if you would, everybody, regardless of where you are. Just take a look. Notice in here, if I click there, Do you notice how everything here grays out? If I click specify a custom SQL statement or a stored procedure, the system expects that either I'm going to click next and I'm going to add my own statement in there, or I've already got a procedure written for me. All right, and we're going to look at both those as we go on in here. And notice there's I can do a select statement, an update, etc. We're not going to worry about that right now. All right, instead we're going to go back and we're going to specify. Now this should look pretty obvious to you what's happening here. All right, so this says by default this should show me the category ID, the short name, and the long name for everything that's in there. All right, well, if I want to change tables, I can change tables. That should be pretty obvious. All right, notice that by default it's going to show me everything, so it shows you down here the query that it's building. All right, if I come in here and I click where, it's going to do exactly what you'd expect. Now, the way we do this is a little hinky, but we'll get to that in a minute. But that will put a where clause in there. So if I don't want everything showing, if I want to do an order by, same kind of thing. All right. Now, the one that's important here is this one, where it says advanced. If I click there, everybody see this? This is the most important part of this part of the lecture here. You'll almost always want to check this, because that'll automatically provide capability for you to insert, update, and delete. So when we go through some of these things like the details view, etc., that'll automatically add a hyperlink to each record, one that says insert, one that says update, and one that says delete. That'll automatically do that for you. All right, so it'll give you that capability. The optimistic recovery, that really is only important if we would all be working with the same version at the same time. We all have our own versions. So if you want to make sure that no one overwrites your changes while you're working, you can check that one. But I'm just going to leave, just generate that one. All right. Now I'm going to go over to next. All right. And it says if I want, I can preview what I'm working on. So I can test the query. I don't have to do that, but I'm just going to try it. And that's what it's going to show right now. Not a whole heck of a lot, but you can at least see that I've got data. That's always a good sign. All right. Whether you click test query or you just totally don't isn't going to matter. You do the test query just for you. All right. So I'm going to click finish. All right. And you'll notice right now I've got the data source, but this isn't hooked up yet to a data source. Does that make sense? So I've got the grid view, and it's not going to do diddly. Oftentimes I might want to come in and maybe auto format it first. All right, and I can choose any of these, so I'll just grab here Snowy Pine. That's fine. So I'll apply that and say OK. Now that's changed. Now for choosing the data source, I can come down here and I can choose the one I just put in. SQL data source. Boom, that's all I did. This doesn't look any different. All right, but notice I can enable all this other stuff. Anything else that I want to enable. Paging, etc. So now if I come through here and I run the program, yeah, we're building errors. That's nice. That's never a good sign. Type name. Yeah. Am I missing? I think it's because I removed all that stuff, but I'm not sure. All right. But what I wanted to show you was just basically the fact that we can come in here and without writing any code, what should be showing here right now, if I hadn't dorked it all up, is just all the information from that table. So I could, if I wanted to, I could create one of these for each table that I have. Also, when I go through here and I start working on the data source, just so you know, when I come in and configure the data source, you already saw what it looked like. All right, we already went through all this stuff. But if I decided I had the wrong table, I could change it. Or if I want to, I can also come in here and say, I'm going to do this. I am going to specify. Why? So I can click next, and I can choose Query Builder. This is a little bit weird to look at because it's something that's actually broken into 3 or 4 different pieces. All right. Did whoever you had the database, the relational database design class with, did you see something like this at Access? Did you ever deal with this? I'm hearing yes and I'm hearing no, which, you know, depending on who you had, I guess that it depends. But you'll notice that when I come in here, it's got all this stuff, right? So I can right mouse click on here and I can choose Add Table. And I'm going to choose the, I don't know, I got categories. How about invoices table? All right. And close. All right. So now if I want to, I can grab information from another table. And you'll notice it's automatically building the join statement for me. All right. Now if you're going to do that, you better be joining on something, and I don't know if mine is or not, but you better be joining on something that actually has something in common. But the point is, I can very quickly build myself up a query. And that's what you're going to see in the chapter as we keep working our way through it. But this stuff, I think at least they base this off of what is in there in Access, because most people have at least used Access or find this intuitive enough to use. If I don't want that anymore, again, I can just click on it, and I thought it was delete, but maybe it's not. So I can click over there. Now it's gone. All right, if I don't want the table anymore, I can remove it. I can add another table. I can have as many tables in here as I want. All right, so maybe products would have been a better one. Yeah, you'll notice that as soon as I added that, now it has something that's in common between the two of them. There's a category ID. All right, so if I come in here, and now I've got the, from categories, I've got the short name and the long name. Well, I don't want short name, but I do want short description. I do want long description. And you'll notice it's building it, and it's got the join created for me correctly. All right, so I can do that. I can say OK. All right, I can tell it again to execute the query and give me some information. You'll notice it's going to give me 23 rows. All right, so I can do next, test query. Yeah, right. I'm going to go back and rebuild this from a blank site, and it all should work. All right. Again, I know those are famous words, but I'll try to do it. All right, right after we get done with the lecture part for today. What I'm more concerned with you seeing right now is if you look in the book on page 136 here, what do they show? Well, they show you here on 135 the connection string, already set to Halloween.mdf, which you saw. And then on 136, they go through how to configure it, which you saw. All right. When you do that, it's going to be building code for you in the background automatically. All right. Whatever code that it needs. So as it says there, there's the ASPX code that you see down here on the bottom of page, or in the middle of page 137. So notice it's got the connection string set up for you, and it's got the select command set up for you. It is possible, just so you know, it is possible for you to even go into this code, the ASPX code, and update it. So for instance, if you didn't want, let's just pretend for a second I didn't want the unit price in the image file for whatever reason. I don't want the image file in there. I could bring this code up, just highlight that right there, and just hit delete, and it's gone. It doesn't hurt anything. You don't have to go back in through the wizard to do it, is what I'm telling you. Now, if you decided that I don't really want to select here, I really want an update, you really shouldn't then go into the ASPX here and make your changes. You should go back into the data source and make the changes. All right, just so you're aware of that. As it says, it lets you create a query using SQL. You can enter the statement directly, or you can let the wizard do it. I tried to show you both. As you go through there, again, when you start to go through it, you're also able to do some customization, as we already also just took a look at. Now, where it gets a little different from what you've seen before is when you start doing binding. All right? And because this has been kind of hosed, all right, what I'm going to do, hopefully I'm not wasting my time, hopefully I'm not wasting your time here, but I'm going to cancel this. All right, I'm going to do a file, close solution, and if it does ask me, no, I don't want to save, and I'm going to do a file, new, project, and I'm going to do, oops, not project, sorry, file, new website, and I am going to do an empty website. All right, and I already have the one that's called CH04 shopping cart, so I'm going to call this CH04SC for shopping cart. All right. So now I have nothing in it, so I will have to go back in and manually add again my new item. So I'll just keep it at default, .aspx, boom, put that in there. All right, I'm going to manually go in and I'm going to add my ASP.NET folder, and I want to add my app data. All right, I want to right mouse click on that, click add existing item the same way we did it before. Make my way back to the P drive as I showed you before. I want to do this because I want it to work. I don't want you to think, well, yeah, sure, he showed it to us and it didn't even work, because that's not the right way to be showing you this stuff. All right, it's back in there. That's good. All right. Now, I should be able to go in and I'm going to do two things. So I'm going to go back here in my design mode. All right, I'm going to come back in and under data, I'm going to first add a grid view. All right, there's that grid view. And underneath that, I'm going to come in and I'm going to add my SQL data source. All right, then I'm going to go back to my data source, and as we tried to do before, I'm going to configure it. Click here. There's my Halloween MDF. Next. Save it as connection string. That's fine. This time I'll choose a little different one. I'll choose products because it's got more stuff in it. All right. There's everything. So I'm going to say next. Test the query. There's all my products. Okay, no biggie. I'm going to click finish. Then I'm going to come back up to my grid view, click over here. I'm not even going to worry about the formatting. Click data source, choose SQL data source 1, enable sorting, selection, paging. You can see all the stuff that was added there as I did that. All right, and notice that when I click sorting, if you look up on, if everybody just take a second here and look up on your screen, I'm going to well, I won't uncheck it. The sorting put this up there, which means that I can now click on any of my headings and it'll automatically sort the whole table based on those headings. If I click on it once, it'll sort it in ascending order. If I either double click it, it'll put it in descending order, or if it's ascending and I click it again, it'll put it in descending order. All right, so now I've got all that stuff. Let's see if it works this time or if I get an error. So there it is. Now it's not pretty. All right, a grid view by default is not pretty. You can go in and change anything you want to change in it. Notice right now it's by product ID. Watch what happens when I click name, how everything got changed. If I click it again, it's in descending order. All right, if I want it back on product ID again, boom. That's pretty obvious what's going on there. All right, and again, when I did this, you see how ugly it is if you put absolutely nothing on it, is if you do absolutely no formatting of it. So that's what I just did. But I can always come back later and click on the grid view and click on the smart tag and auto format, and autumn, for example, which is a little bit more nicer looking, but it still doesn't look real nice. All that's really doing is it's changing what your headings, the background, and it'll change your color. You can also go in and do that with CSS if you want to. All right, but it's still going to be pretty ugly right now because I put everything in there. But all I wanted to show you was how we can get everything in there. All right. So if I go back now, and I want to go back to my data source, all right, and I want to go back to configure, and I'm going to click next. You know what it's set to right now. You've already seen that. All right. But I want to bind it. So I want to come in here and bind a drop-down list to a data source. All right, so before I can do that, well, I don't know about you if you agree or not, but looking in here right now, I have no drop-down list. All right, and it's kind of hard to wedge one in there, so I'm going to go back into source mode. All right, and right before I've got the data source, actually right before I put the grid view in here, so right there, I'm going to go in and manually drag in a drop-down list. That's under my standard controls, so I'm going to drag it in. Why am I doing that? Because I want to be able to take that drop-down list and I want to be able to have it fill up information based on what I pick in the drop-down list. Does that make sense? All right. But when I have it show me what comes in via the drop-down list, the thing is right now I'm showing every record by default because that's what the grid view shows me. All right, and I don't necessarily want that. So I'm going to come in here also, and in my design, back in design mode, I don't want this thing anymore. And it's gone. So I've got my drop-down list, but now I'm going to come through here, and under my drop-down list, I'm going to come in and I'm going to add a details view. All right. You say, well, that's what you had in there before. No, this is meant to just show one record. All right. Does that make sense? It's meant to show just one record. That's all I want to show. All right. Okay. So what we want to be able to do then is we want to be able to go and bind that drop-down list to a data source. As it says, once you've created a data source, you can bind it to a drop-down list. You can bind it to a lot of different controls. If you want to give the user the ability to choose just about anything they want, it's usually going to be something like a drop-down list. All right. If you don't want to use a drop-down list, if there were only 2 or 3 selections and I wanted to show all of them at once, I could also bind it to a list box instead of a drop-down list. So you can bind it to just about whatever you want. So as it says, select the choose data source command from the smart tag in the drop-down. Then when the drop-down list is displayed, choose the data source in the first drop-down list. All right, and they're going to show this in this next page. So they chose SQL data source 1. Then the column that provides what you want to show in the drop-down list. Well, what do I want to show? Now think about this. All right, if I'm going to show everything that's in my products table, I probably don't want to show the product ID because that might be too hard for somebody to figure out what the heck it is. I probably want to show something in there like the product name. Does that make sense? That's what I want to have showing in there. Finally, as it says, select the column that you want to use as the value to be selected by the user. So when I jump back into here now, don't need that. All right, this has been set up already. I may need to reconfigure that, but at least it's been set up. All right, but right now this drop-down list is hooked up to nothing, and this details view is hooked up to nothing. So at a minimum, I want to go into the details view, and I will do a little bit of cheap formatting there, and I'll hook that up so it's hooked up to my data source. So now notice it's how smart it got right away. All right, again, it's designed to show me the information for one user. What you'll see when we get into this in later chapters, by default, it's showing me everything because I selected star, but I didn't have to. For instance, if there's no reason to show the image file, it's just wasting space, so I don't really have to show that. All right, but then I come in here in the same way. I want to click my drop down, choose data source, and this is where it changes a little. So select the data source, SQL data source 1. All right. So this is showing you what is in the book on pages 138 and 139. All right. So it says here, next select the column that provides the data that you want displayed in the drop-down list. Again, the column you select here is used for the drop-down list's data text field property. In the figure, the author chose the name property. All right, so I'll choose the same. Finally, select the column that you want to use as the value of the item selected by the user. All right, so the author says here, I selected the product ID column. Now think about what this means. All right, in English, what this is saying is, okay, for this data source, for this drop-down list, all right, I want you to go through the database, and based on the product ID that I provide you, I want you to show me the associated name. Does that make sense? All right, because that's exactly what they're telling you right there. All right, and as far as I can tell, at least, what they show in the book on 139 here is exactly the same thing that I just showed you. All right. Now, if you need more than I just gave you, or you don't like the explanation, all right, if you don't like that stuff, you can always go back and again take a look in your book, and underneath the picture they show you both the code that was generated and what's new on here. Data source ID equals SQL data source 1. That's new. If for some reason you didn't want to do it through the smart tag, I don't know why you wouldn't, but if you didn't want to, you can also click on here. You can go to the properties window, and there's a data source ID in here also. So either one of those ways will work. or you could manually go in your source code and you can add it in there. So there's like at least 3 ways that you can do all this stuff. I don't want to continuously show you 3 ways because I find that to be confusing. But just to show you it that once, that you could do that. And again, if you want more information than I just gave you on what all those fields are, they're shown right there on the bottom of page 139. All right. Okay, I want to do about 4 more pages, and then we're going to call it a period. All right. So on the next page, the author says here how to use C# code to get data from a data source. Okay. It is possible to use C# code and get data from a data source without writing any code. All right. We could still go back to our data source. We could put a where statement in there, and there's a bunch of stuff that we could do. The point is, typically, what you'll want to do is you'll want to be able to make the database interact with the C# classes that you write. All right? And that's what we're going to do in the next class period. In that case, you're going to have to go in and add your own C# code to actually make, so when you want to be able to tie together your ASPX files, your ASPX.cs files, and your regular .cs files, you'll need some code. So that's what they start talking about in here. All right. It says for the shopping cart app to work, it must retrieve the data selected by the user from the drop-down list. All right. It says although there are several ways to do this, none of them are all that easy. One way is you can create a second data source. That's why I told you can have as many data sources in here as you want on a page. And the only thing I will tell you is when you create a data source, and I didn't do this, all right, I went through the wizard too fast, but I didn't give it a real good name, so it was called SQL Data Source 1. You probably want to go back and rename that data source something that's indicative of what the data source is supposed to do. And I wouldn't call them Halloween 1, Halloween 2, Halloween 3. That's no better than SQL Data Source 1, 2, and 3. All right? But by giving them a name that's at least somewhat reflective of what you're trying to do with them, it makes it much easier if you've got 4 or 5 data sources on the same page to figure out which one you want to use. So it says another way to do this is you can write code that retrieves the information. All right, that's the technique the shopping cart application uses. However, as it says, to make this work, you've got to add the classes and the methods and the properties that are going to be shown in figure 412 on the next page. Now, I don't want to go over the code right now, but I do want to mention this to you. When you take a look at what's in here, and it sounds a little weird, but I'm going to take it from this part right here. What this is saying right here, what this is basically saying is, hey, go through the stuff that I've just set up, grab the information in the appropriate field, and copy it to a local variable. Does that make sense? All right. Well, so then let's look at what's here. All right. Notice it says data view products table equals, then it's got data view in parentheses, SQL data source 1.select, all right, data source select arguments.empty. All right, let's talk about that first. When you call this SQL data source.select, when you call that in there, what it returns by default is, I believe, just an array of more or less string values. But you want to be able to use a data view with it. So in order to be able to use a data view with what you've got here, you've got to cast that SQL data source select statement so it matches what you want to use. All right? Does what I'm saying make sense? It's just the same way if you want to be able to combine ints and floats and whatever. All right? Then what they're saying here, and I don't remember right now what the argument empty is, so I think it's up here someplace. To get all rows, the select options parameter should be set to data source select arguments empty. So when you first go through this, you're not sure exactly what particular record or records you're going to want to get. So you typically have to set to that. Then we're starting to filter it down. Now it's saying give me everything, but now I want to filter it to only show me the ID that I've just selected in the drop-down list. All right? And then what they're saying here is basically what I want to do is I want to go and fill up my data view with that particular row, for lack of better words. That's what we're doing in here. All right. Now, I maybe made it better, maybe made it harder than it had to be. But again, that stuff is all explained in here, probably in much better English than what I just used. I'm just trying to give you an overall picture of what's going on. All right. So let's quickly talk about session state, see if we can finish this up by 11, and then we'll pick it up next time on page 146 with the business classes of the shopping cart app. Much like PHP, which you'll find as we get into that class, you can use sessions and you can use cookies in ASP.NET. All right, you can use them both. Now, when I come back in here and I look at this and I run this page again, hopefully this will work. I didn't hose it up. All right, notice Freddy arm. Now notice when I change. Something's hooked. I didn't have that hooked up yet, but you saw that at least this was right to begin with, okay? It isn't changing. I'll have to fix that so it works. But what I want to show you is this. You see the page here, all right? When I right mouse click and I choose View Page Source, you get this. And look at how far out this goes. That's view state. That's an array that ASP.NET saves that's got most of your program information in it. You get it by default. You can turn it off. You can turn it on for the entire site. You can turn it on a page basis. You can turn it off totally. But it's not something you should be jacking with. All right? But what I'm telling you is, by default, internally, ASP.NET does some work saving session state for you, as you see right there. All right? But usually, that's way too hard to work with. All right, it's very confusing. If you are going to be going back and forth from page to page, as the author does in this chapter, going back and forth between the order page and the cart page, and eventually by a checkout page, and I don't know what else you're going to have, but something else maybe, all right, you're going to want to be able to keep session state so you can pass variables back and forth between pages. All right, and the author talks about session state in here, all right, and they mention about halfway down, it says, by default, ASP.NET sends the session ID to the browser as a cookie. Then when the browser sends another request, it automatically includes the cookie that contains the session ID. So that stuff happens behind the scenes, for lack of better words. All right? And they mention, although ASP.NET automatically uses session state to track user applications, you can use it to pass data back and forth. We will be doing that. We will already be doing that in this chapter, just so you know that. So it'll be the first time that you'll get to see working with session state. The author mentions here 3 reasons that you might want to do it. First, you might want to use session state to maintain information about a user. Why is that? Well, as you're perusing your way from page to page, you might take, for example, the user's login and password and put it in a session. So if they try to go to a certain page, you can go back and you can check that session state variable, and you can say, does that match somebody who has these particular authorizations? Are they authorized to go to this page, type of thing? All right, so that's one reason. Second, you can use it to save objects that you're working with. All right, as it says, if you're working with a customer's record and you want to be able to pass that information back and forth, name, address, city, state, zip, credit card info, etc., you can pass it all in one swoop that way. Third, as it says, you can use it to keep track of what operation the user is currently performing. So you've seen this kind of picture before, that it's HTTP request coming from the client to the server, HTTP response, HTTP responses going back from the server to the client. All right, and as you start working with this stuff, those are the 3 reasons. So again, if you don't like my verbiage, look at what the author uses. But what you're going to see, and you'll see more in later chapters, is when you work with this stuff, you'll work with, literally, you'll work with something that goes inside of brackets that's called sessions. Looks somewhat similar to what we saw in PHP. And you can take those variables and they can appear either on the right-hand side of an equal sign, where you're copying them from a session into a local variable, Or they can appear on the left-hand side of an equal sign, where you're setting the value of a session state variable either from something local, all right, or from something you want to set. Now that's it, but the last thing I want to tell you is, if you say that doesn't make sense, I think it does more than you think. Because on 145 they show you this. And there's not a lot in it, but they show you how you can update a session item. All right, so you can grab something that's in a local class that's called cart and copy it to your session variable called cart. All right, and if you can remove things from session. All right, you can do a lot of work with sessions, but last thing I'll tell you is if I turn back in the book to kind of where we started here, so I want to turn back for just a second all the way to page 119. Think about why you'd have to use this. If I'm going to choose one in here for a quantity, and I'm going to click Go to Cart, and I do go to Cart, I want to make sure that Go to Cart has not only that quantity, but also that price information and the description information that I would get from here and here. Does that make sense? I want to move it from page to page. I don't want to constantly, I want to do one database access because that tends to make the be more server intensive. So I want to do it once, save the information that I need inside of session variables, and then use it in my program. All right. Now as far as how to do that, that's when we get into using our C# classes. So I'm going to stop it here and we'll pick it up next class.